Hello, how are you today? Today we are going to visit the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, also called Saint Teresa of Jesus. She was a prominent mystic, Carmelite nun, writer of the Counter-Reformation, and theologian of contemplative life through mental prayer. She was a reformer of the Carmelite order and is considered to be a founder of the Discalced Carmelites. First of all, let's discuss the name Teresa. It is a girl's Latin name of Greek origin, meaning late summer or harvester. In English, it is pronounced Teresa. In Spanish, it is Teresa. In Italian, it is Teresa. In French, it is Thérèse. And in Korean, it is pronounced Teresa. Alternative forms of this name include Tracy or Terina, and its most common nicknames in English are Terry, Tess, Tessa, and Reese. Additionally, the Avila in Saint Teresa of Avila stands for the province of Spain that she hailed from. Another saint of the same name would be the French Carmelite nun, Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, France, who is also known as the Little Flower of Jesus. She lived from 1873 to 1897, and her feast day is on the 1st of October, while the feast day of Saint Teresa of Avila is on the 15th of October. Before we examine the life of Saint Teresa of Avila, let's go over some historical background information. The Counter-Reformation, also known as the Catholic Revival or the Catholic Reformation, was in place during the 16th century. Specifically, it began with the Council of Trent, which took place from 1545 to 1563 and ended at the close of the 30 Years' War in 1648. The major elements of the Counter-Reformation were ecclesiastical reconfiguration, religious orders, spiritual movements, and political dimensions. It was marked by new spiritual movements such as the French school of spirituality and the Spanish mystics, of which Saint Ignatius of Loyola, Saint John of the Cross, and Saint Teresa of Avila were the key figures. Saint Teresa of Avila was born in 1515 to Don Alfonso de Cepeda and Beatriz de Ahumada as the third of 9 children. Teresa's parents were keen to raise their daughter as a pious Christian, and it is said that she began praying fervently at the age of 6. Then, at the age of 7, she ran away from home with her brother, Rodrigo, to find martyrdom among the Moors, only to be found and brought back home by an uncle. Afterwards, she and her brother spent most of their early childhood trying to live like hermits, with religious thoughts dominating their minds until their mother passed away when Teresa was just 12 years old. It was then that she turned to the Blessed Lady to conquer her sorrow upon her loss. During her early adolescent years, Teresa grew close with a female cousin who stimulated her interest in worldly things, much to her father's dismay. Upon taking notice of this change in Teresa's personality, her father placed her in a convent of Augustinian nuns in Avila, where other privileged young women of her social class were being educated. It was here that Teresa was first made aware of the worldly danger that she had just barely escaped. However, after about a year and a half at the convent, she fell gravely ill and was brought back home by her father. She eventually recovered, and then fearing being forced into an uncongenial marriage, she began to deliberate whether or not she should undertake religious life. After reading the letters of Saint Jerome, which was introduced to her by an uncle, she made the decision to pursue religious life. When Teresa first announced to her father her desire to become a nun, he refused consent, telling her that she may do so upon his death. This reaction was very difficult for Teresa, as she loved her father dearly. However, early one morning in the year 1536, she secretly left home and went to the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation, just outside the town of Avila. She was 21 years old at the time. Of this painful step, she wrote, "I remember, while I was going out of my father's house, the sharpness of sense will not be greater, I believe, in the very instant of agony of my death, than it was then. It seemed as if all the bones in my body were wrenched asunder. There was no such love of God in me then as was able to quench the love I felt for my father and my friends." A year later, there was a recurrence of illness for Teresa, and in turn, Don Alfonso had her removed from the convent. When she had a seizure and regained consciousness 4 days later, she discovered that people had already dug a grave for her. Afterwards, she was paralyzed for the next 3 years and never quite regained her health completely. After a period of intense suffering, during which she received strength from reflecting on chapter 2, verse 10 of the book of Job, which says, he replied, "You are talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said, and she gradually improved. She was helped by certain prayers that she had begun to use from a little book called The Third Spiritual Alphabet by Father Francis de Osuna, which had been given to her by her uncle, which contained prayers of recollection and meditation. Using this book as a guide, she began to concentrate on mental prayer and progressed towards the prayer of quiet, which rested in divine contemplation, all worldly things forgotten. She also occasionally attained the prayer of union, in which all of the powers of the soul are absorbed in God. She persuaded her father to apply himself to this form of prayer, and then after 3 years, Teresa returned to the convent. So what now can we gather from the life of Saint Teresa of Avila? The gift of God to Teresa, through which she became holy and left her mark on the church and the world, is significant. In the face of pain and suffering, she was given the gift of mysticism. She was a holy woman and an active reformer. She was given the strength to overcome her arduous, lifelong struggles through ongoing purification and suffering. This is what was given to her by God. Teresa was a woman for God and for others. She was a woman of prayer, discipline, and compassion, and her heart belonged to God. She courageously struggled, and she struggled with her own mediocrity. But in the midst of this, she clung to God through prayer, and in turn, her writings have helped generations of believers. Teresa believed that prayer was a conversation with God, much like a conversation with friends, a conversation not stemming from contemplations about trials and longings, but from love. Among the writings of Saint Teresa of Avila, 3 can be indicated as the depositories of her spiritual teaching: an autobiography, the Way of Perfection, and the Interior Castle. An autobiography sincerely recounts her revelations without any self-love or pride. The Way of Perfection was composed for the guidance of her fellow nuns, and the Interior Castle was written for all Catholics on the spiritual life.